When the Nintendo Switch 2 announcement finally went live, a lot of people landed somewhere on the spectrum between excitement and disappointment. There were people who wanted it to be more. They wanted it to be different. They wanted it to be exciting. Kind of like the jump from the Wii U to the Switch. They were hoping that the Switch to the Switch 2 would be this like big, grandiose unveiling. No matter where people landed along that spectrum, I think most people kind of walked away from that trailer thinking, this looks like the Nintendo Switch, but it's a little bit different. There is also a third group of people, and they're not watching this video. When I get into my elevator at my office, there's a little tiny screen that like recaps the day's news stories. And I couldn't take a picture of this in time, but the news story in the elevator the day after the Switch 2 trailer went live said, Nintendo announces successor to the Nintendo Switch. That was the whole story. And most of the people in my office building, if I were to guess, saw that and went, huh, or didn't see that at all. And that's all they'll ever know about the Nintendo Switch. You are not one of those people. You clicked on this video even though it doesn't even say Switch 2 in the title because you knew what mouse mode meant. Anyway, if you walked away from that Switch 2 trailer thinking this is just the Switch, but it's a little bit different, you're not entirely wrong. There are, I think, 3 major takeaways from that trailer. 3 things that Nintendo wanted you to think about when that trailer was over. The first is exactly that. It is the Switch, but it's a little bit bigger. It's a little bit different. The screen goes and then it gets bigger, and oh my god, that's exciting. The Joy-Cons, they get bigger, oh my god, that's exciting. The colors are different, everything about it's got a better kickstand, like all of that little minute stuff that separates the hardware from the first hardware, that's obviously important. The second most important thing that Nintendo wanted you to take away from that trailer is that there's going to be a Mario Kart on it. Notice they don't even say it's a new Mario Kart. They are just showing the public there will be Mario Kart. There are a lot of people like in that elevator crowd, who will just watch that trailer and walk away thinking that's Mario Kart 8. They will not be scrubbing through frame by frame. They won't notice that Donkey Kong's model looks different than it did in Mario Kart 8. They're not noticing any of that. They're just saying that's Mario Kart, baby. And that, honestly, hugely important takeaway. Mario Kart 8 is the 5th best-selling game of all time. I did say this on a recent episode of Into the Aether, a low-key video game podcast, but I do feel like the individual who decided to put Mario Kart 8 on the Nintendo Switch made the single greatest business move in the video game industry's history. That decision is about as earth-shattering as putting Wii Sports on Nintendo Wii, which, by the way, Wii Sports, number 3 best-selling game of all time. All Nintendo needed to say was, there will be Mario Kart on this thing, and people don't really care if it's Mario Kart 8 Deluxe or if it's Mario Kart 9. They're just happy that there's going to be Mario Kart on it. I'm just happy there's going to be Mario Kart on it. And guess what? The Nintendo Switch 2, it's backwards compatible. So, I can still play Mario Kart 8, even if the new one's bad. It won't be bad, but even if it is. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, probably the best Mario Kart. Actually, it is the best Mario Kart. I'll say it. And that takes us to the third thing that Nintendo wanted you to take away from that trailer. It's mouse mode, baby. It's mouse mode. To catch you up really quick, mouse mode is the ability to take a Joy-Con off the Nintendo Switch and then slide it around your table or whatever like a mouse and, click around. And it's pretty simple and also like transformatively huge. I think people are severely underestimating how big of a deal mouse mode is. If you're following the lineage of Nintendo as a video game company, what you're seeing is a company that's very interested in exploring the ways in which we interact with video games. It starts obviously with the Famicom or the NES, the idea that you can have an arcade experience at your house. That's transformative as well. That's a pretty big deal. Then you get to things like the Game Boy, the ability to take video games with you out of the house. Like not only do you not need to go to an arcade, you don't even need to be home anymore. You could be on the subway playing video games. That's pretty cool. You get to things like the Game Boy Advance SP with the clamshell form factor, hiding the screen and the buttons on the inside so you're not damaging it or whatever. And then, of course, the Nintendo DS. We have a touchscreen on the bottom. Years before the iPhone comes out or smartphones are the norm, we have Nintendo exploring the idea of using touch input as a way to interact with video games. It's also got 2 screens and, again, clamshell form factor. I'm just going to take a brief aside and say I think the Nintendo DSi is the single best designed piece of Nintendo hardware ever. I think it is like the most beautiful thing they've ever made. Also, it's got a camera on it. So silly and so great. I love this thing. I love this thing so much. Taking the DS a step further, the 3DS obviously adds 3D to the formula of the Nintendo DS, and then you have things like the Nintendo Wii, motion control input, the Wii U, kind of the same thing with also that weird thing that you're supposed to do where you're playing golf on the ground or something. I don't really know. That never really came to fruition. And then, of course, you have the Nintendo Switch, the ability to take your home console with you on the go. There is no line between what is a home console game and what is a portable game. They merged all of their development studios together. It's a hugely ambitious version of what they tried to accomplish with something like the Game Boy. The Nintendo Switch is kind of the culmination of all of those experiments, right? It's got a touchscreen on it, it's got motion controls on it, and it is the blurring of that line between home console and portable console. But it is missing something really important. The Nintendo DS, for example, allowed you to use your touchscreen while also pressing buttons. The Nintendo Wii had the ability to be using motion controls while also pressing buttons. That dual input, that ability to use this new interesting thing about a Nintendo device while simultaneously being able to use classic control input, I think is actually really important to the formula, and it's something that Nintendo Switch doesn't do super well, if I'm being totally honest. If you're trying to hold this thing in a way where you are maneuvering and pressing all these buttons and also using the touchscreen, it's super awkward, very heavy. I would not recommend doing it. And that brings us back to mouse mode, which I think is going to be as transformative for the way we interact with games on the Nintendo Switch 2, and maybe just interact with games in general, as touchscreen input was on the DS and motion controls were for the Wii. Specifically, the ability to bring mouse mode with us, again, feels like that jump from the NES to the Game Boy. And to get this out of the way, I do think that mouse mode can be used in a way to replicate the inputs of all those devices I just mentioned. This is just speculation, but there's a world in which you use the kickstand and put the Nintendo Switch 2 up on your table or something. It is still somehow plugged into the TV, and what's on the Nintendo Switch 2 screen is the bottom screen of the Nintendo DS, and what's on your TV is the top screen of the Nintendo DS, and you're using mouse mode to interact with the bottom and using the left Joy-Con to press buttons to interact with the rest of the game. That way you could be playing games hypothetically like Metroid Prime Hunters, a game I'm sure everyone is dying to be playing in 2025. Actually, if they release Metroid Prime 4, I think there's a non-zero chance people will be excited about checking out Metroid Prime Hunters again. I'm trying to decide if I'm one of those people. I don't know if I'm one of those people. You let me know if you're one of those people down in the comments, I guess. In a similar vein, imagine playing something like the Okami port for the Nintendo Wii on the Switch 2, where you could be dragging the mouse around to paint with the spectral paintbrush. That's pretty cool. I think that'd be really exciting. The reason I think this is going to happen is that it enables growth for Nintendo Online, their subscription service that I'm sure they want to continue growing. I think one of the first things we ever heard about the Switch 2 was Furukawa saying something to the effect of, your Nintendo Online account will carry over from the Switch 1 to the Switch 2. That was the first thing we ever heard about the follow-up to the Nintendo Switch officially from Nintendo, was you can still bring your Nintendo Online account across. So, you know, it's important to them. Adding something like mouse mode enables them to then have a Nintendo DS section of Nintendo Online, or a Nintendo Wii section of Nintendo Online. I think they're probably just going to port those games, like the Nintendo Wii games, kind of like they're doing with GameCube stuff. They seem to be just porting GameCube stuff instead of adding it to Nintendo Online, but, you know, a man can dream, right? I don't have to sit here and just take life as it is. I can look out into the horizon and expect something bigger and grander for myself, like Nintendo Wii support. Put Okami on there. Put Resident Evil 4 on there. I love Resident Evil 4 on the Wii. I played that game, I think, like 40 times, all the way through. It might have been even more than that. I played that game a lot, dude. The other thing that mouse mode is obviously great for is just shooters as a genre. Shooters are going to be great on Nintendo Switch 2 if you have mouse mode involved. You know, Phil Spencer has already said out loud in interviews that he is excited to support the Nintendo Switch 2. They have already said, as of the past like year or two, when they were trying to acquire Activision Blizzard King, I always forget the King is involved there. When they were trying to acquire Activision Blizzard King, they said that the next Call of Duty will launch on Nintendo hardware. In this case, the Nintendo Switch 2. I would be shocked if we didn't see native mouse mode support for the next Call of Duty. I think that's like kind of an obvious thing. But also imagine like Splatoon 4. There's gonna be a Splatoon 4, obviously. Splatoon 3 has wrapped up in terms of all of its live service content, in terms of its DLC. Splatoon 4 is definitely in the works. But in general, I think shooters are gonna pop off on the Nintendo Switch 2. I think using mouse mode with one hand and then using a Joy-Con in the other hand to like move around with the analog stick and press a bunch of buttons, I think that's gonna be a huge deal. I think it's gonna be really exciting. And it's kind of a new way of interacting with video games. You know, how new is it? Somebody out there is really excited about the Lenovo Legion Go, which is a big PC handheld that also has the ability to take the controllers off, and one of them you can like clamp down in this thing and use kind of as a mouse kind of joysticky thing. I'll tell you this much: Lenovo lent me a Legion Go for 1 month, and I sent it back and was like, I am uninterested in buying this for myself. Like, this is not a thing I want to do, and I did not really enjoy their version of mouse mode. And speaking of PCs, I think the most important thing that Nintendo Switch 2 is going to get from having mouse mode included is an unbelievable amount of third-party support. People would be making games like indie games on Steam and Nintendo Switch, and like those were the two platforms they were supporting. It was like a game would come out on Steam, it would become a big hit, and the first thing those developers would say is, we're making a Switch port. Isn't that exciting? And sometimes it would come to the other consoles, whatever, it would hit Game Pass on Xbox or something, but Nintendo Switch was always a priority. But also that form factor, the ability to just have this like little kind of tablet thing with some Joy-Cons attached and take it around with you, that feels really fresh, that feels really native, and that feels like a really fun way to be taking a bunch of indie games with you. And it wasn't really until the Steam Deck came along that we started to see that break outside of the Nintendo Switch in a way. But for so long, that was the thing. But if you were making a game that was built for PC first, something that was using a keyboard and a mouse, it was really difficult to make your game work on the Nintendo Switch. Things like Slay the Spire, for example, they feel fine with controls, but it feels a lot better to be using a mouse when playing Slay the Spire. When I was playing Slay the Spire on the Switch, I was just using the touchscreen more than anything else. Touchscreen made the most sense. A game I really loved, Loop Hero, was one that I remember playing on PC and immediately thinking, I wish this could be on the Switch, but it is so mouse intensive, I didn't know how they would do it. And if I'm being honest, I like what they figured out in terms of the Switch port, but it doesn't feel as good as using a mouse. And a lot of games will feel that way. There are a lot of games where it'll be really difficult to just port it to a thing that only has buttons or a touchscreen. And then bigger games, like Civilization 7, which is coming out this year. That's going to be a big deal when you can use a mouse instead of needing to use whatever horrid controls they had for Civ 6 on Nintendo Switch. I did not enjoy that port, personally. I like that game enough. I like Civ 5 more. I'm always a Civ 5 guy. But I'm excited for Civ 7, and I'm excited specifically to be playing Civ 7 with mouse mode, because they're definitely going to support it. Civ is always going to feel better with a mouse. I think the thing that's interesting about Nintendo is that they're always a little bit ahead of the game, right? Like the Nintendo DS having a touchscreen on it, that's the precursor to every phone we have in our pockets these days. Something like the motion controls on the Nintendo Wii, despite not really panning out with the Xbox Kinect and the PlayStation Move controllers, we're seeing that stuff. We're seeing motion controls everywhere in the VR space right now, and VR is just getting more and more popular. It's still a pretty small niche, but it's bigger than I thought it was going to be. And the Nintendo Switch's idea of taking your home console games with you on the go is now really coming to fruition with things like the Steam Deck. Like Valve had kind of the same idea, but for PC gaming, and that's a pretty big deal. The success of those two devices have pushed the industry in a wild way. We're now hearing rumblings that both PlayStation and Xbox are working on their own handhelds to compete with the Switch and also the Steam Deck. And even though they're always kind of ahead of the game, I do think that Nintendo, post GameCube, has kind of removed themselves from thinking about the other players in the space as competition. I don't think they see PlayStation or Xbox really as competition. And that's why you hear a lot of people saying, like, buy a PC and buy whatever Nintendo console you can get, because the first party stuff on Nintendo is not going to come anywhere else, but the first party stuff on Xbox and PlayStation these days, that sure is coming to PC. And I'm starting to think that Nintendo might see Valve and the Steam Deck and the growing relevance of PC handhelds as competition. I think it's the first time I've gleaned from Nintendo that they might be feeling a little bit of, competition sweats. And I think mouse mode in particular feels like a direct shot across the bow. Like, yes, the Steam Deck had touchpads on it, but, they were good, but not great for some games. Playing something like Civilization on the Steam Deck is a little bit tougher than I want it to be. Mouse mode feels like Nintendo saying, we have a better idea of how this is going to work, and if you're making a game for PC, you might as well make it for the Switch. Why not? Why not do it? It's free money. I see a lot of conversation about mouse mode online, and a lot of people say, like, oh, that's just a thing that they're not going to really support that often. It'll be like, the microphone on the Nintendo DS. Like, how many games really use the microphone? They're not going to use mouse mode. I think there's a world in which a lot of people use mouse mode. The biggest thing holding me back from, like, full-throated support of mouse mode, though, is how awkward I think it's going to be. I don't know in what situations, like, you can sit on a couch and use mouse mode. That's the thing that concerns me the most, unless accessory makers go wild like they did in the Nintendo Wii era and start building like laptop pads to put, that's a thing that already exists, like a kind of pillow with like a flat surface on top so you can put your laptop on and sit on the couch and like work on your laptop. I guess you could buy something like that and use it for mouse mode in some ways, but it still feels really cumbersome, and needing to buy an extra accessory to use mouse mode in a way that feels comfortable doesn't feel very Nintendo to me. So I don't know what their plan to solve for that in particular is. Now, I happen to have a standing desk, which, it goes up and down, whatever. I have my Switch dock on my desk. There's a world in which I could just be using mouse mode. Like, I'm already set up in a way where I am using the mouse and keyboard to control stuff on my desk. Like, how much of a jump is that to just use the Joy-Con? I don't know. Like, maybe that's the intended purpose. I'm interested to see if Nintendo has a better answer for when you're supposed to use mouse mode. Anyway, what about you? How do you feel about mouse mode? Do you think it's exciting? Are these just the ravings of a madman? Both can be true. Also, either can be true. You tell me in the comments. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching and or listening. And I love you so much. Bye, everybody.